This foreign policy lecture will focus primarily on the Iran-Contra scandal. And then the next two will be more on the Cold War and relations with the Soviet Union. So just being quick about it, thinking about the comparisons I've been making between Reagan and Trump. If you think about last week's lecture, where I spent a lot of time on immigration policy, they really are extremely different with regard to immigration. Environment, not so much in terms of difference, that there are a lot of similarities in the handling of environmental issues, and even looking at the kind of people that were appointed to the most important environmental positions in the administration, the head of the Interior Department, the head of the EPA, and there are certainly, I think, some parallels between James Watt and Rick Perry, who's head of Interior now. No, he's the head of Energy. Interior is Zinke. And I think there's a real strong parallel, because I think Zinke's from Wyoming. James Watt was from Wyoming also. And one of the differences is that if you remember back in the early 1980s, there really wasn't so much a focus on climate change yet. Environment was a big issue. The environmental movement had really taken off since around 1970. There'd been Earth Day being now celebrated annually. So there was a lot of concern about the environment, but it was posed not quite in the same terms as today's debate. And as I said, I think the parallel in terms of appointing people to environmental positions, whether it was James Watt in Interior or Ann Gorsuch Burford as head of the EPA, their primary emphasis was on getting the government out of the way from the development of natural resources. And that meant basically cutting back on environmental protection policies and literally cutting back. This is another really quite clear parallel. Just as the Trump administration has proposed and is cutting funding for things like the EPA or environmental protection, that's exactly what Ann Gorsuch Burford did. She cut number of staff, she cut funding for the EPA, and had it, really kind of get more out of the way of development issues. Now, one of the biggest controversies, Watt and Burford were both pretty controversial appointments, but controversy over environmental policy peaked in some ways around the treatment of what was called a Superfund, the cleanup sites where there had been toxic pollution, and Congress had appropriated special funds for cleaning up the toxic residue that had come from certain sites around the country. And the person that was appointed to head the Superfund cleanups was a woman by the name of Rita Lavelle. How many of you remember that name? A number of you do. Well, in 1983, she was appointed in 82, I think, to that position. In 83, charges surfaced which ultimately led to her being convicted of perjury about the misuse of Superfund monies for the cleanup, directing it toward friends and other issues, which actually led to her being convicted of crimes. And she was forced out, and Ann Gorsuch Burford soon thereafter also resigned her position. And I'd say it wasn't that the environmental policy of the Reagan administration dramatically changed to great concern for the environment after '83, but there was less of that overt kind of reversal of environmental policies after the Lavelle scandal. And so I just would describe that as a reduced focus on environmental issues in terms of controversy, but not really a dramatic change in policy. And then just any comments, recollections, or questions about environment? Okay, seeing none. A quick pass through to social issues. And again, thinking about parallels, which I made the very first class between Trump and Reagan, that social issues and social concerns, and especially by evangelical Christians who are concerned about the moral direction of the country and who are concerned about issues like abortion, school prayer, that was an important force behind the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. It's certainly not the most, I wouldn't say it's the most important. The economic issues, foreign policy problems that Carter was having were certainly critical to Reagan's defeat of Carter in 1980. But evangelicals who had supported Carter in 1976 didn't see their issues being addressed by the Carter administration, and a lot of them switched to supporting Reagan, who made a definite attempt to appeal to evangelical Christians. And that there certainly is a parallel to Trump's appeal to evangelical Christians and the support that he's been getting from them. But in terms of making parallels, you think about Donald Trump, you wouldn't describe him as an evangelical Christian. and his whole, whatever you think about his policies, Trump, in terms of his character and personality, it's a strange match, Trump and evangelical support in a lot of ways. To some extent, you could say that about Reagan, who was also divorced. But Reagan was brought up in a quite religious home. His mother was very religious. He may not have been a big churchgoer, but his belief was really kind of unquestioned in a way that you might have some questions about what it is that Trump believes in terms of religious attitudes. But as president, Reagan definitely, in terms of appealing to evangelical conservatives, was an opponent of abortion, even though I remind you that as governor of California, he signed what was then probably the most liberal state abortion law in the country, because this is before Roe versus Wade. And school prayer, he also was critical of Supreme Court decisions that had restricted prayer in the public schools. And so he actually supported constitutional amendments to both do away with abortion and also to allow school prayer. So he was supporting positions that clearly did have an appeal to evangelical conservatives. But, and it's an important but, every historian who's written about Reagan agrees that these were not high up on his priority list. I mean, he basically, and in some sense, it wasn't that he was against or that he was for abortion or that he was against school prayer, but what concerned Reagan was his economic policy, tax cuts, increased spending for the military, taking a stronger position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Those were the things that really concerned him and that he wanted to expend political capital on. So it was really much more rhetorical support rather than pushing the social agenda. And actually very little, not nothing, but not very much happened with regard to these issues while he was president. And just one other social issue, I'm sort of racing through this, but I haven't said anything about Reagan and civil rights really to speak of. And this was another major issue of concern during this time. Well, it still is, but it was certainly high up on the list of issues during the Reagan presidency. And among the issues that was getting a lot of attention was affirmative action. And the Reagan administration was very clearly not sympathetic to affirmative action. Reagan, in terms of his whole attitude towards civil rights, there are very few people who accuse Reagan of having been racist in his attitudes. There's an incident when he was actually pretty young where he actually stood up for an African American who was being denied a place to stay when they were traveling together. And I mean, there are instances where his personal attitudes did not seem to be racist at all. But in terms of policy, Going back to 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Reagan, like his hero Barry Goldwater at that time, was opposed to the civil rights legislation of the 60s, really kind of in the defense of states' rights and wanting to have, lesser government interference in the daily lives of people. Again, I don't think he was against the Civil Rights Act of 64 for racist reasons, but he was not a fan of civil rights intervention by the federal government in local social mores. And that carried over into his administration where this Justice Department really reversed approaches by the Carter administration, and actually even previous administrations, to pursue a more active support for civil rights. In fact, as an example, and I'll just stop here, when the Voting Rights Act came up for renewal, because when it was first passed in 1965, it had a 7-year time limit on it, and then had to be renewed periodically. And Reagan was critical of renewing the Voting Rights Act. It was renewed and he did sign the legislation, but not because he was pushing it. Okay, so any comments, questions before I turn to foreign policy?
What would you say about Reagan and AIDS?
What would I say about Reagan and AIDS? The Reagan administration clearly delayed in responding to the AIDS crisis, and I think there's not much question that it was an issue that got put in a context of religious attitudes, and especially by evangelicals who, in some, certainly not all by any stretch, but there were a number of evangelicals who saw the AIDS epidemic as it began as sort of a punishment for homosexual behavior, and the administration really kind of just stayed away from the issue longer than I think a lot of people think it should have. I think one of the things that finally got the Reagan administration to begin to address the AIDS issue was when Rock Hudson died of AIDS, and Reagan knew Rock Hudson, and I think that moved him to become a little bit more involved in the issue. But that was, after the epidemic had already been going on for several years. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so. Oh, yeah.
I just have a comment about Trump's appeal to the Christian conservatives. I've been puzzled over that for a long time. And I read an article that said that it goes back to views of Jonathan Edwards and that God can act in amazing ways. There are passages in the Hebrew scriptures about King Cyrus being God's anointed. So, it's just something very strange.
Could you hear Marianne's comment? She was commenting about trying to understand Trump's appeal to evangelical Christians and how on the face of it, it does seem strange in a way, but that many evangelical Christians will refer back to the notion that God can act in mysterious ways and through surprising agents, and that may help to explain it. I think the key thing about today in Trump's appeal is that many evangelicals look at the issues, they ignore the person and say, is he supporting our issues? And there's no question, I think much more strongly even than Reagan in terms of those issues, that when Trump is able to act in ways by executive authority, he is addressing some of the issues of evangelicals. And so a lot of people saying, well, then the result, we may not agree with everything that the person does or says, but we like the result of some of the actions he's taking. Okay, then here we go, on to foreign policy. And just a couple, before I'm going to make a number of preliminary comments before I actually get to the Iran-Contra scandal. Looking at the Reagan 8 years in office, certainly I think among historians, the biggest debate about his conduct of foreign policy is one that I'll be addressing in the next couple of classes more than today. But I thought I'd get it out there right at the beginning, in that you all know that the Cold War, in essence, it didn't quite end while Reagan was president, but certainly soon thereafter, the Cold War basically ended. The Soviet Union even fell apart. And certainly many of those, they're very highly qualified historians, and certainly many of the political supporters, people who are sympathetic to Reagan in general, basically argue that Reagan presidency deserves credit for basically winning the Cold War. That the pressure he put on the Soviet Union resulted in the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, and basically a great victory for the United States as the Cold War came to an end. So that's one point of view. As I'll talk about much more later on, there are plenty of historians who take a different view, who say that you have to look at a bigger picture to understand how the Cold War came to an end. Although, I'll go on to this, that I think virtually every historian would say, looking at Reagan's two terms and relations with the Soviet Union in the first term and the second term, it's like a switch was turned on, changed pretty dramatically in the second term in terms of the way he dealt with the Soviet Union. Even those who are not as big as supporters of Reagan recognize that he basically kind of changed direction after 1985. And that's the next couple lectures. The one I'll talk about the first term, when no one would have, I don't think anyone was predicting in 1983 that the Cold War was very soon to come to an end, and that within a few years there'd be no Soviet Union. If anything, people were worrying about the dangers of nuclear war and the growing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. Second term after 1985, and the coming to power in Russia, Soviet Union, of Mikhail Gorbachev, Reagan, I think, as I'll say, certainly deserved credit for recognizing that there was a change in the Soviets' leadership, and that required a more flexible policy on the part of the United States. Now, a couple of other things, one of which I really won't talk too much about, and the other I'm going to focus a lot on today, is that aside from direct superpower relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and especially arms control issues, which became very important, especially in the second term, if you look at Reagan's use, or the Reagan administration's use of the CIA in covert action in certain trouble spots in the world, Central America, which we'll talk about today, and then also in Afghanistan, the Reagan administration, and this is some of his, those who are favorably inclined toward evaluating his presidency, will argue that Reagan's willingness to use covert action to try to not just contain the further spread of communism, but to roll back governments, especially in Nicaragua and in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union, or at least leftists, were exercising authority, that moving beyond containment was an important part of the Reagan strategy. And we'll look and see what that meant in Central America today. But I would say, the policy towards Central America, which I'm going to look at today, and the Iran-Contra scandal, one thing it certainly raises is a question about the limits of executive authority, or what the limits should be of independent executive authority without the approval or the involvement of the legislative branch of the government. And I'll give you a hint, right? One of the questions I'm going to ask is, when we look at the Iran-Contra scandal and what the Reagan administration did in the Iran-Contra scandal, the question arises to me is that was sufficiently serious violation of laws and the Constitution that why was there not more discussion, real discussion, of the possibility of impeachment over the kind of activities that Reagan engaged in Central America and in relationship to Iran? Okay, so now we'll go back to the 1980 election and how foreign policy played out in that. I talked a little bit about this before, so I can go through this pretty quickly. You know, maybe no one here will forget this, but it's interesting how in 1980, before we got to the general election of Carter against Reagan, in the Democratic primaries of 1980, remember Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination. And while a lot of the focus of Kennedy's challenge had to do with Carter's domestic policy, there was also a challenge from the left that Ted Kennedy made regarding Carter's handling of foreign policy, which seems kind of, if you don't remember, it may seem kind of strange now when you think about the campaign, the general election campaign of Reagan against Carter. Reagan was certainly criticizing Carter for being too soft on communism, for not, being strong enough in the military, and so you think of Carter as, soft and a lefty. But in the primary season, Ted Kennedy was basically criticizing Carter because in 1979 and 1980, following the Iranian Revolution and the hostage taking in Tehran, and then the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979, Carter basically switched. Before Reagan became president, Carter was already switching to calling for much higher military spending, called for boycotting the Moscow, called for and did boycott the Olympics that were taking place in Moscow, cut off some of the trade to the Soviet Union. So the U.S. was already sort of switching direction from the earlier stages of the Carter administration, where he had tried to pursue a policy of détente with the Russians and was more critical of military spending. So things were already changing, and Ted Kennedy was objecting to Carter taking a harder line on military and defense policy. But then, once Carter fought off Kennedy, Reagan certainly made good use of the problems that were developing in Iran with the hostage situation and the appearance of weakness on the part of the United States. That I'm sure you all remember how when the hostages were taken in I guess it was November of 1979, then Carter said, "I'm not leaving the White House until we get this situation resolved," which was a big mistake to have made, because that would have meant that he would have, stayed in the White House for more than a year. And the appearance of weakness when the news, you remember how, which network news was it that said day one of the hostage crisis? Nightline. It was Nightline, which actually just came into existence, I guess, at the time of the hostage crisis. That continuous repetition of reminding people about the United States seemed, completely unable to respond effectively to a situation in which more than 50 Americans were being held hostage. That was a major issue for Reagan. And then the failed rescue attempt was, sort of further evidence that Reagan could cite that Carter was being ineffective. And then that was just exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. Now, if you remember, the Russians went into Afghanistan not to overthrow a pro-Western government and to establish communism. There was a communist government in Afghanistan that the Russians went in to support. But again, this just created this whole appearance that Carter was insufficiently standing up to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And that Ronald Reagan, going back in time, this wasn't just with regard to Carter, but Reagan had been critical of Richard Nixon for pursuing a policy of détente and trying to negotiate with the Russians, signing arms deals or arms control agreement with the Soviets. There had been the SALT I and SALT II agreements that Reagan was very critical of, and that Carter had supported at least until the Afghan invasion. So Reagan was basically saying, let's move away from détente. You can't have constructive negotiations with the Soviets. They're a dangerous threat. And Reagan promised, elect me, and I'm going to rebuild our military and take a much more forceful position in confronting the Soviet Union. Now, as I said, Jimmy Carter had already begun to increase military spending in the last year and a half of his administration. So what Reagan was actually, didn't seem like this to most people, but what Reagan was actually calling for was just sort of building upon a change of direction that Carter had already begun. But certainly, when it came to creating an image of who's going to be more forceful in supporting a strong defense and standing up to the Soviets, there was no way that if that was going to be the nature of the debate in 1980, that Carter could effectively counter Reagan's appeal to the American people. But, and this is my last point in sort of preliminaries, in terms, Reagan obviously won by a huge margin over Carter. It was like a 9 percentage point difference between the vote for Reagan and the vote for Carter. But Reagan still only got 50% of the total vote. It was not one of the great landslides in terms of, he didn't get 60% as Nixon had done, Lyndon Johnson had done. He got just 50%. And one of the reasons that his appeal was still, I mean, he won easily. There was a third party candidate, you remember John Anderson, but there was still a lot of people in America who were afraid of Ronald Reagan in terms of foreign policy. They were afraid that the kind of tone he took about a military buildup and standing up to the Russians could be quite dangerous. So in terms of what kind of mandate he had, he did have something. He was able to get through an increase in military spending very soon after he got into the presidency, but it wasn't as if there weren't real concerns about Reagan and foreign policy before he took over as president. Okay, and I'll stop again for a second if there are any comments or questions before I now finally get to the Iran-Contra thing.
What were Russia's aims in going in since Afghanistan already had a communist?
Because there was an internal struggle within Afghanistan between two different, they were both actually communist, but one was more favorable toward the Soviet Union and a Soviet presence or influence in Afghanistan. So, yeah, and the struggle was not between, there were no mujahideen, there was no Islamic fundamentalist movement at that time in Afghanistan. It was more of an internal struggle among leftists within Afghanistan, with one faction being more the faction that was actually in power being more supportive of the Soviet Union, and that government actually called upon the Soviets to come in to support it.
I came in with a very hidden presence.
Well, it got bigger quite quickly, because then as soon as once they came in, then that led to the development of the Mujahideen, the Islamic opposition, and then the guerrilla war. Actually, it became more than guerrilla war. So their presence really helped to prompt what then later developed in Afghanistan. Right?
I think I find it interesting that our response to Afghanistan in the 80s was a response of, pulling out of the Olympics and doing all these things. And our response today or recently to the taking over the Crimea has been softball so much more. I think that's very interesting how we responded much more aggressively in the 80s than we've responded to Crimea recently.
Could you hear that comment? Yes.
In terms of the appearance of weakness on Carter's behalf, can you say anything about the so-called malaise speech? Because the appearance of weakness was only a foreign policy thing. It was a sense that Carter had given up on America or did not understand the mood of the nation, whereas Reagan did.
Yes, Dwight was referring to the famous malaise speech which Carter gave, which was more in kind of a response to domestic economic issues than to foreign policy issues, and how Carter seemed to be advancing the notion that the United States had to learn to live within certain limits. You know, and remember when he talked about energy, and he had that, it's not the malaise speech, but he had that other time when he was wearing the sweater in the White House to show that we're going to have to be more careful about conserving energy, and you know, basically kind of downplaying that, not projecting this optimistic, you know, view that we can do whatever, you know, we want and everything's going to be great. Whereas, you know, one of Reagan's great appeals was that he was always seemingly so sunny and optimistic. And again, that was one of the great differences between Reagan and, say, Barry Goldwater in 1964. Barry Goldwater really did scare people, and a lot of other conservatives seemed, you know, more kind of angry or just in some ways, like that was a contrast I made with Trump today, that it's a much more kind of fearful approach, whereas Reagan was quite optimistic. So yes, that it was not, you're absolutely right, that the notion of weakness was not only foreign policy, because there were all those problems with the economy, and the fact that also Carter had not been a very effective legislator. You know, he'd had an energy, you know, there was the energy crisis of the 70s. You know, Carter came up with major energy proposals. He could never really get what he was proposing through Congress. He had a number of other, you know, problems about being effective. Okay, any?
There was the debate, Reagan better off, or
Yeah, you know, I was mentioning the debate that the most effective campaign slogan that Reagan probably had was, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" When the answer was clearly not, you know, in terms of certainly the economy. Okay, then turning to the Iran-Contra scandal. And, you know, it's kind of maybe a little bit hard to remember that the first kind of really big foreign policy issue when Reagan became president was one that would ultimately kind of, the country itself would kind of fade from the center of consciousness, even though it continued to be a subject of involvement, and that was El Salvador, tiny little Central American country. But when Reagan became president, El Salvador, tiny, poor, but basically ruled by really a handful of families, very unequal distribution of wealth, and in Carter's last year, in early 1980, well, I'll get to El Salvador. I'll do a preliminary first. I should do, because this directly relates to El Salvador. The year before civil war broke out in El Salvador, in 1979, as I'm sure a lot of you remember, the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua came to power. The Sandinistas were a leftist that had been a guerrilla group, in some ways modeled after what Fidel Castro had done in Cuba in overthrowing the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. In Nicaragua, There was a dictator by the name of Somoza, whom the United States had helped to put in power, and going all the way back to the the family back to the 1930s, actually. And no one would have described Nicaragua in the 1970s as a democracy or as a country where wealth was in any way equitably shared among the people. And I mean, Somoza was highly criticized by many people in the United States, and even people in the United States government during the 1970s. There was a terrible earthquake in the capital of Nicaragua, Managua, in the early 70s, and Somoza was actually charged with taking Red Cross blood donations and then selling them on the black market. I mean, he was not a nice guy. And there had been a long history in Nicaragua of American involvement in Nicaragua. At least since the 1920s, actually, I shouldn't say at least, in the 1920s, the United States Marines were in Nicaragua for a number of years, supporting a government which was resisting an insurrection which was led by a man named Sandino. That's why later on, the group that would ultimately come to power in Nicaragua is called the Sandinistas, in honor of this person who in the 20s was ultimately killed, but who had been leading a kind of an uprising against the existing government of Nicaragua in the 20s. So a guerrilla insurrection reemerged in Nicaragua in the 70s and ultimately was successful in overthrowing Somoza. And in fact, in the United States and in the Carter administration, the initial reaction was, well, Somoza, we actually cut off aid to Somoza in the last stages of his rule out of recognition that this was not a guy who was a Democrat, and that the Sandinista movement, the United States and the Carter administration initially thought that there would be a possibility of having pretty decent relations with the Sandinistas. That didn't really turn out very well, and so even before Carter left office, relations between the new Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which the United States recognized as the government. We had diplomatic relations, but tensions were already growing before Reagan became president. But as I said, the focus wasn't so much on Nicaragua, where the fighting had ended at the end of 1979. The Sandinistas were in power. The growing tensions were on the diplomatic level and whether the United States would continue to provide any kind of assistance to Nicaragua. Inspired in part by what had happened in Nicaragua in the beginning of 1980, so again, still when Carter was president, an insurrection against the existing government of El Salvador developed and turned pretty quickly into a bloody struggle and more or less a guerrilla-style war in 1980. And again, just as in Nicaragua under Somoza, no one thought of the El Salvadoran government as a great democracy. And I'm sure a lot of you may remember that this is in 1980, so this is before Reagan became president. The government and the paramilitary forces supporting the government in El Salvador became increasingly ruthless in trying to suppress critics of the government. The most kind of highly noted examples of that ruthlessness that got the most coverage in the United States was that the Archbishop of El Salvador, his name was Oscar Romero, was actually assassinated while giving a mass because he had criticized the government and expressed some sympathy for the insurrection which was taking place. 4 American nuns, and I'm not sure that they had much to do with the the insurrection. They didn't have anything really to do with the insurrection which was taking place, but they were also raped and murdered in 1980 by groups that were associated with the paramilitary forces supporting the government. So this was a pretty, bloody situation taking place while Reagan was president. And Reagan advisors told him that as he took office, that there was a very good chance that the insurrection, which was certainly led by leftists who were inspired by the Sandinistas, who were beginning to get some support from Cuba, Reagan was basically told this could be a spread of another Cuba-type situation in Central America. We need to stop the spread of communism into El Salvador. And that was the initial reason that the Reagan administration became involved in Central America. It was basically Reagan agreed, in spite of the concerns about human rights violations by the El Salvadoran government, to increase military aid, send military advisors to assist the government of El Salvador in putting down the insurrection that was taking place. And as part of that, well, here's the maps, just so that you know what we're talking about. There's El Salvador. And then when you see Nicaragua, it's not contiguous with El Salvador, but it's very close. And by the time Reagan took office, the Sandinistas, being sympathetic and support more than sympathetic, supportive of the insurrection in El Salvador, the Sandinistas were supplying some assistance to the rebels in El Salvador. And indirectly, Cuba, which was supporting Nicaragua, so the Reagan administration is saying El Salvador is a battle against the spread of Cuban, Nicaraguan, and ultimately Soviet influence in Central America, arguing that before we know it, there could be Russian bases in Central America. Okay. Now, exactly how to handle this situation, and also recognizing that the Nicaraguans were at least somewhat involved in El Salvador. They weren't directing everything that was going on there, but there was some connection. And so how to respond to this situation? There was a debate within the Reagan administration, an ongoing debate that lasted basically through the whole time that Reagan was president, about what should be done. And I'm just taking two of the leading figures in this debate. There were others who were involved in the discussion. This is William Casey, who was the head of the CIA. And William Casey said, not only should we be supporting, the El Salvadoran government to prevent the spread of communism, but basically we ought to take advantage is not the right exact phrase, but we ought to go beyond that. And he was interested in trying to roll back the sway of the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua. He was interested in what, I don't think they used this phrase then, but later on would often be referred to as regime change. And what he was arguing basically is that, well, the Nicaraguans are supporting the rebels in El Salvador. Not only do we need to take action against the Sandinistas to stop any flow of arms into El Salvador, but we ought to go beyond that and take action in some way to basically try to get rid of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Now, Casey and no one was saying, let's send American troops into Central America. We can easily overthrow the Nicaraguan government. I mean, remember, this is very soon after the end of the Vietnam War. There was hardly anybody, no matter how hawkish they were, who thought that it was a good idea to send significant numbers of American, fighting men and women to engage in an action which could in any way be kind of seen as another Vietnam. So when Casey talked about supporting a policy to overthrow the Sandinistas, he was saying, well, we have to do this kind of through third party. And there was a very small movement in 1981, which would come to be known as the Contras, which initially were people who had been connected to the Somoza regime, his National Guard. Some of them, and a very small number initially, had fled Nicaragua and were in Honduras, neighboring Honduras. Very small numbers, but were interested in kind of going back into Nicaragua to take actions that could ultimately get rid of the Sandinista government. And it was Casey's view that, yes, let's support the Contras. They may help us interfere with arms shipments into El Salvador, but they might also then ultimately build up to be a force that could overthrow the Nicaraguan regime. On the other hand, George Shultz, who in 1982 became Secretary of State, but he was had long been around. He'd been Nixon's Secretary of Labor and would become a preeminent figure in all these debates during the Reagan administration. And again, he's not the only one who took this position. He basically said, yeah, I support giving aid to the El Salvadoran government. Whatever its flaws, it's better than what the alternative might be. He accepted that notion. And yeah, it might, he did go along with the initial decision to give aid to the Contras, but his notion was not that we're going to try and support a group that will militarily overthrow the Sandinista government. That's not realistic. All I want to do is I want to, basically try to negotiate with the Nicaraguan government to get them to stop supporting the rebels in El Salvador and maybe make some other concessions about making sure that Nicaragua doesn't become more of a Cuban-Russian, quote, base in Central America. So he had much more limited objectives. By December of 1981, Reagan made the decision. They'd already been helping the El Salvadoran government, but in December of 1981, Reagan made a decision which was not publicized. It was a presidential directive to the CIA, basically, calling for the beginning of covert aid to the small Contra movement, which was based in Honduras. And again, for Reagan, apparently, he was sold on this idea primarily on the basis of, if we aid the Contras, the primary purpose of that is to try to cut any arms flow from Nicaragua to El Salvador. He was not sold on it initially on the basis of, we're going to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Okay. Within a year, by a year, although it still wasn't like publicly, proclaimed by the government of the United States that we're aiding the Contras, it wasn't like a big secret anymore. And Congress in December of 1982 passed an amendment to one of the Defense Appropriation Acts. It became known as the Boland Amendment after the congressman from Massachusetts, Ed Boland, who was its primary author. The Boland Amendment basically said we should not be giving military aid to the Contra movement. Again, so now the focus is shifting away from El Salvador. Aid was continuing to flow to El Salvador a continuing, very bloody civil war was going on in El Salvador, but what would ultimately become the heart of the so-called Iran-Contra scandal focuses more on it focuses on the Contras in Nicaragua. So I'm going to sort of drop off El Salvador. It's not as if the problem there was resolved. Okay, so Congress tried to restrict aid through legislation. That didn't work too well. Because the CIA, again, this was covert, not publicized to Congress or the American people. In January and February, I put U.S., it was the CIA actually, laid mines in Managua Harbor. The idea there was that this will try to prevent ships, coming from the Soviet Union or Cuba, bringing more supplies into Nicaragua to support the Sandinistas to fight what was now a growing Contra movement. The Contras ultimately did attract not only former supporters of Somoza, they were the ones who started it, but some others who had become disenchanted with the Sandinista movement, who had been originally supportive of the revolution in Nicaragua. Some of those became disenchanted with the direction that the Sandinistas were taking. Some of them did join the Contras. So there really wasn't just one point of view in the Contras, although former Somoza supporters certainly were a prominent part of that movement. Now, I forget how long it took before the mining became a matter of public knowledge, but Congress made another effort later in 1984, in October of 1984, a second Boland Amendment. The first Boland Amendment seemed to have had loopholes that they didn't really allow, I think, the aid that was going to the Contras, but at least someone could interpret it as allowing the aid to go through. So Congress made a second effort to cut off this growing involvement and support for the Contra movement. And that Boland Amendment was much more explicit, although one thing, and it named a variety of agencies of the United States that were banned from giving direct military aid of any kind to the Contras. Certain kinds of humanitarian assistance were allowed, but nothing in the form of anything military. And they actually spelled out a whole bunch of the agencies of the federal government. But one which was not specifically named was the National Security Council. And one of the reasons the National Security Council was not named in the Boland Amendment is that the NSC is basically it's not supposed to be carrying out operations. It's not like the CIA or the armed forces. The NSC is supposedly purely in a kind of an advisory body giving advice about policy to the president, not an operational group that carries out operations in other parts of the world. And so the Boland Amendment did not mention the NSC by name. It basically mentioned everything else they could think of that might carry out any kind of military aid or military operations. And I put bipartisan vote. There were plenty, it wasn't unanimous, because there were certainly many people, not only Republicans, but a lot more Republicans than Democrats, who were sympathetic to the idea of supporting the Contras and trying to get rid of the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. It wasn't unanimous, but there were also plenty of Republicans who, like the majority of Democrats, thought, we've seen this story before where the United States becomes involved like this, and it could become something of a quagmire. We actually have diplomatic relations with the Nicaraguan government. We're not supposed to be trying to overthrow a government with which we have diplomatic relations. So it wasn't unanimous, but it was bipartisan, more Democrats than Republicans, but it wasn't just one or two Republicans that actually supported the Boland Amendment. You know, when the Boland Amendment was passed, this led the Reagan administration to say, well, if they're cutting off, if the Congress is trying to cut off funding, and the administration, and including Ronald Reagan, were now strongly supportive of the Contra movement, and were really kind of desirous of seeing it be able to overthrow the Sandinista government, what other sources of funding could we come up with to give to the Contras in support of their effort? And as I look at my watch, maybe I should give you the 5 minutes now and hold you in suspense as to what the other sources of funding. I won't even bring it up on the screen here. So we'll take 5 minutes and then I'll come back. I think we're ready to keep going.
We're in suspense.
I'm sorry?
We're in suspense.
We're in suspense. Yeah, because nobody has a clue how they did this fund. I bet all of you probably know, but I will reveal it one thing at a time. Okay. Okay, if the law means that there are not going to be congressional appropriated monies for support to the Contras, one way would be find private individuals who are willing to donate substantial sums of money that will then be directed, you know, to support the Contra effort. And it came out, this wasn't, well, certainly there were people that knew this at the time, but it certainly came out later during the course of the congressional hearings about this whole situation that a pattern developed where certain big rollers, conservative rollers who were likely to be sympathetic to the idea of trying to support the Contras and overthrow the Sandinistas, a number of them were actually invited to the White House. They often got a briefing from Colonel Oliver North, who was a member of the National Security Council, about the situation and the dangers of the Sandinista government and the desirability of supporting the Contras. And then sometimes they would then get to shake hands with Ronald Reagan, and then as they left the room, they'd be asked to write out a check. And so some monies were collected through private solicitations. I remember one of the people who was solicited like this was Joseph Coors, the head of Coors Brewery. But there were other prominent conservative donors who actually donated money. But that was only a small part of the money that would ultimately be raised. A much more lucrative source, rather than individuals, were other countries. Other countries that would like to be in the good graces of the United States government. And so, again, it was often members of the National Security Council who had contacts with foreign governments and basically indicated, wouldn't you like an opportunity to support freedom fighters trying to overthrow this evil government in Nicaragua? And a number of countries responded. The most significant was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia ultimately, the government of Saudi Arabia ultimately donated $32 million to support the Contras. And then, and this is where we're going to make the transition to this whole situation as it was developing in Central America and Nicaragua, it's called the Iran-Contra scandal, as you all remember. So ultimately, some connection developed between dealings with Iran and support for the Contras. And that connection came through what became known as the diversion. In the course of supplying arms to the Contras, the National Security Council and the CIA, which took the lead in this whole effort rather than the Defense Department or the State Department, because of the difficulty of making direct arms transfers to the Contras, out of American military stocks, given what Congress was saying about this, Oliver North ended up contacting some private citizens that became basically an intermediary in being able to acquire weapons which they could then transfer to the Contras. And there's Oliver North, I'm sure you all remember him, and the two prominent people who headed what came to be known as the Enterprise. This was a private business venture sponsored by the NSC and the CIA, because William Casey was certainly well aware and supportive of this effort. Oliver North ended up dealing with Richard Secord, who was now, this is him in uniform, but he was a retired Army general, and Albert Hakim, who was an Iranian-American businessman. They basically set up a company that could purchase weapons with these funds that are being supplied from these other sources, get weapons, some of which, a lot of which came from the American government, but whatever sources they could find to get weapons, and then they could transfer them to the Contras. And when, let me go back here. This became linked in 1985, 86 to another arms sale opportunity, and that was selling arms to Iran. And this same group that had the so-called Enterprise headed by Secord and Hakim, when they were making these transfers to the Contras, they weren't really making a whole lot of money out of it. They were making some, but not a lot. But then, for reasons I'm now going to get into in a second, the Reagan administration ultimately would choose to sell arms to the government of Iran under the Ayatollah Khomeini. And before I get to how that came about, the connection to the Contras was that Oliver North came up with the clever idea. This Enterprise small group, when it's selling arms to Iran, we could sell them at inflated prices. They really want the weapons. Remember, Iran was actually fighting a war with Iraq at this time. We can sell those weapons at inflated prices, make really big profits, and then we can take some of that profit and then funnel it back to getting more weapons for the Contras. It's called the diversion of funds from the sale of weapons to Iran back to the Contras. Again, this didn't compare with the amount of money that was raised by going to Saudi Arabia and some other countries. But it would be the source. I think ultimately it was about $2 million worth of profits were rechanneled. Some of the other profits went just back to the individuals who were involved in the arms sales. This was private enterprise. Okay, so go back and give you some reminder about what was going on in the Middle East and ultimately how the United States would get to a position where Reagan would ultimately approve, and Reagan was directly involved in giving approval to the sale of arms to Iran. Why he gave that approval is subject to some debate. But to go back, I know this is kind of confusing. I hope I'm not overly confusing here, but I have to go back to Lebanon in the early 1980s to get to where we need to get by 1986, 87. Lebanon, which for a long time in the Middle East had been a model of calm and peaceful wealth, actually. It was a banking center. Everything was wonderful in Lebanon until, in some ways, the Palestine Liberation Organization came to Lebanon and created all kinds of internal turmoil, leading to a long-standing civil war, which was going on when Reagan became president. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, to try to basically get rid of the threat posed by Palestinians who had relocated to Lebanon. And the Israelis ultimately went all the way to Beirut in 1982, as I think a lot of you will probably remember. At that point, Israel and the Palestinians reached a negotiation whereby the armed Palestinians in Lebanon agreed that they would leave. But they would leave on the condition that there be some external force that would come in to basically guarantee their safety as they disentangled themselves from the Lebanese situation. And it was not the only country, but one country that then became involved in essence, sending what could be described as peacekeepers into Lebanon, or at least to sort of safeguard the exit of the Palestinian fighters out of Lebanon, was the United States. So the United States went in a kind of a more or less neutral way initially into Lebanon in 1982. But it's really complicated. I'm sure, as a lot of you know, in Lebanon, there are a lot of different factions involved in Lebanese politics and in the Civil War. And to make a long story short, before too long, the United States got kind of drawn in to ending up supporting, this is after the Palestinians were gone, it ended up becoming involved in supporting the Christian minority government that was ruling in Lebanon at the time. Didn't really rule over all of Lebanon, but that had at least some degree of control and certainly was the established government. And what that led to was attacks against Americans who were now perceived as backing the Christian side in the Lebanese Civil War. And you all remember that in 1983 that there was a terrible terrorist incident where the U.S. Marine barracks were blown up and well over 200 Marines were killed. There was also a bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, where there were substantial casualties. And what also happened, and by 1984, the Shiite group in Lebanon known as Hezbollah, which is still a prominent factor in Lebanese politics and is also present in the Syrian civil war backing the Syrian government, that members of Hezbollah began taking American hostages. It wasn't only Americans, but we're concerned about taking American hostages. That really began in '84 and was continuing on into 1985. Hezbollah Shiite group within Lebanon was definitely gaining, had support from the Iranian government. And it's in that context, with Americans being held hostage in Lebanon, but by a group that had ties to Iran, that, and again, this is also during the time when Iran is involved in a very bloody war with Iraq. And it's also at a time when the Ayatollah Khomeini, the key figure in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, was quite elderly, and people in the CIA and elsewhere in the government were talking about what's going to happen when Khomeini dies, what direction is Iran going to take after he's gone, after Khomeini is gone. And Reagan, well, Oliver North and it wasn't just Oliver North, the national security advisors, the first one was Bud McFarlane, and then he was followed by Admiral Poindexter, brought forth an idea of selling arms that Iran was badly in need of. And what was the reason for it? Well, there were a number of factors that influenced Reagan's decision and he signed a secret directive, it's called the Finding, approving the sale of arms. And there were at least, I think, 3 or 4 separate arms sales that took place to Iran that were conducted by that group, the Enterprise. They're the ones that actually, Hakim was himself of Iranian background, and he had contacts back in Iran. And so there were several sales, and what were the factors involved in that? Well, one of them, and I think even though Reagan had always said the United States would not deal with hostage takers, and that it was certainly the policy of the United States after the Iranian Revolution and the taking of hostages in Tehran of the American embassy, it was the stated policy of the United States certainly not to sell weapons to Iran. We had an embargo on. But Reagan may have been influenced by several factors. I think there is no doubt that he was moved by the plight of the hostages. And he basically, the idea that having some sort of opening to Iran would help to get the Iranians to use their influence to get Hezbollah to release the Americans being held hostage. More than likely, that is certainly what was especially on Reagan's mind. But he also was told, especially by William Casey and Oliver North and some others in the administration, that Khomeini's not going to be around for a lot longer, and these arms sales provide an opportunity to create some ties to people in the Iranian government who might be less militantly anti-American. And so this is a way of sort of paving the way for a better relation with Iran after Khomeini, and that might mean Iran using its influence in other ways in Lebanon to ease the situation, not just the hostages. And then, of course, Oliver North saw this as a great opportunity. These arms sales, if he got the Enterprise to actually handle them, then the Iranians are going to basically, they'll pay more than these things are worth because they don't have a lot of sources for what they want, and we can divert funds to support the Contras. What a neat idea that is. So, for all those reasons, in spite of the fact that such a policy seemed to contravene certainly a stated American policy about dealing with hostage takers and dealing with Iran, Reagan gave his approval. This was all secret. Certainly the Congress did not know about this, and the American people did not know about it either. The Israelis were directly involved in these transactions, so the Israelis knew about it. Okay, so I've mentioned North's idea. Now it was sort of it wasn't an accident, but what would have been seemingly a minor incident that ultimately led to the unraveling of the secrecy, and that was in Nicaragua, a plane was shot down that was part of this enterprise of supporting the Contras, and an American who was basically under the employ of the CIA was actually captured, and it began to come out what these connections were, how the United States was supporting the Contras. And the first kind of publication, ironically, was in Lebanon that had a story that basically began to lead to the publicizing of this whole complicated story of the connection between supporting the Contras and selling arms to Iran. And that led to the appointment of a joint special committee by the Congress, something we haven't seen. What we have now are independent committees. There's a House committee, or House committees, plural, and Senate committees doing various investigations. This was a joint committee chaired, and I was asked during the break about who's in control of Congress at this time. Well, the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. throughout all of Reagan's presidency, the Democrats had the majority in the House of Representatives. The first 2 years of the Reagan presidency, the Republicans had a small majority in the Senate, but then afterwards, the Democrats had a majority in the Senate as well. So this committee was chaired by Daniel Inouye, the Democrat of Hawaii, and the House, Lee Hamilton, Democratic congressman from Indiana. And how many of you remember, I remember watching the hearings. How many, you know, it wasn't quite like Watergate, but it was close in terms of the amount of coverage that was taking place. And I'd say that in terms of what got the most attention during the hearing, there was always a question about what did Reagan know? When did he know it? Did he know about this diversion of funds? Had he approved arms for hostages? Had he willingly been breaking, you know, violating the Boland Amendment? These were all questions that were there, but a lot of what the focus was on was the National Security Council and Oliver North. I mean, to many people, Oliver North became the villain of the piece because he was centrally involved in both sides of the equation. And he was the government person. He was basically the operations officer for these things out of the National Security Council. But if you remember also, you know, I had that picture of Oliver North in his uniform. When he testified wearing that uniform, and especially when he was talking about the support for the Contras, you know, he was basically arguing, you know, even if Congress wasn't willing to support this, this was what was necessary for American national security. This was the right thing to do. And to, I would say it's a minority, but to a significant number of Americans, he actually came out of the hearings in some sense as a hero for having, you know, pursued by any means necessary what he thought was appropriate for American national interest. On the other hand, a lot of people saw him, after he acknowledged during these hearings that he destroyed evidence. Once it became public, he started destroying evidence like crazy to trying to cover up what could well have been seen as illegal activity. And I'd say the congressional investigation, it never determined conclusively exactly what Reagan knew. He already, in 1987, when these hearings were going on, he did have a hazy, it might have actually been pretty legitimate that he often had a kind of a hazy memory about things. There were documents, but it's also, he had been insulated to a certain extent. His National Security Advisor, Poindexter, his National Security Advisor, Admiral Poindexter, had basically indicated that Reagan was kept out of the loop about a number of things. So there was no definitive conclusions about Reagan. He later kind of acknowledged, you know, kind of that he had been willing to approve the arms sales to Iran out of his concern for the hostages. But he also said, well, this was really kind of contradictory. He acknowledged that, but also said, but I never really thought I was approving, you know, arms for hostages. I don't know, it is kind of hard to make out exactly what he was acknowledging and not acknowledging. Now, the other thing that happened, do you mind if I go over 5 minutes? I'd like to, well, those of you who mind, you can leave. but I got to finish, because I don't want to leave you with a couple of conclusions. Just quickly, there was also a special counsel. That was in the days when there was a special counsel law, which there no longer is. That was appointed by a three-judge panel to investigate this whole thing, and so he had independent prosecutorial authority. And the special prosecutor ultimately brought 14 criminal prosecutions as a result of this whole matter, including a lot of the leading characters, North, McFarland and Poindexter were national security advisors. Elliott Abrams, he's the one who Trump turned down as Undersecretary of State, not because of his involvement in this matter, but because he had criticized Trump during the campaign. He was he was Assistant Secretary for Latin America during this time and had been involved in the Contra matter. Now, of those 11 convicted, when Bush became president, he actually pardoned 6, and only one of those convicted, somebody I've not even mentioned, he was a businessman who made some profit out of the transactions, not Hakeem or Secord. He was the only one actually to spend any time at all in prison. And North and Poindexter and a lot of the principals, they ultimately got off on an appeal because the court held that their testimony before Congress meant that some of that evidence, they had gotten immunity to testify before Congress, and that some of that may have been used against them, however, in court, and therefore they got off too. But the last point, in 2 minutes worth, is, when you look at the face of this, the Congress of the United States had said we should not support the Contra effort to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. And the Reagan administration went ahead against the explicit directive of Congress to try to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. I mean, of all the things, that would seem to be a really serious matter to me. And yet, there was really very little push for an impeachment of President Reagan on this issue. And I just thought, and there was some question about how conscious he was of what was going on, but I think it requires at least some comment. One thing, this was all coming out in 1987. He'd already been president for 6 years. It's pretty late. Impeachment would have taken a long time. So, I mean, I think it's much less likely that somebody's going to be impeached very late in a second term. But there's also the fact that Reagan's popularity was seriously hurt by this scandal. If you remember, if you did popular opinion polls, definitely his ratings went down, but he still was well liked personally. He wasn't thought of as being an evil person or doing anything that he did here. Most of the attention was focusing on the sale of arms to Iran, not the violation of the Boland Amendment. And in terms of the sale of arms to Iran, well, he clearly was motivated not by some nefarious reason, but because he was trying to get the hostages released. Of course, once the sales of arms took place, then the Hezbollah took more hostages, saying, this is a good deal. So it didn't work out too well. Some were released, but more were taken. And then also, and this is what we'll get to next time, by 1987, the United States would sign the first under Reagan, first arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. There's a lot of positive stuff going on in other areas, which I think also did have the effect of lessening any desire to try to have a major change of leadership. Well, thank you for tolerating the extra time.